Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Anglo-Zulu War, 1879. Now buckle up as we begin. The year 1878 witnessed mounting tensions in southern Africa as British colonial ambitions clashed with the sovereign Zulu Kingdom. Sir Bartle Frere, the ambitious High Commissioner for Southern Africa, viewed King Cetshwayo's powerful military state as an obstacle to British Confederation plans. The Zulu nation, forged by the legendary Shaka Zulu decades earlier, commanded respect through its disciplined impi regiments and formidable military tradition. Cetshwayo ruled over approximately 250,000 subjects with an army capable of fielding 40,000 warriors. The British Empire, fresh from recent colonial conquests, underestimated both Zulu military prowess and their determination to defend their ancestral lands. Border disputes along the Buffalo River provided the perfect pretext for Frere's aggressive imperial designs, setting the stage for a conflict that would shock the Victorian world. Sir Bartle Frere orchestrated a deliberate provocation through the Boundary Commission of 1878, ostensibly established to resolve territorial disputes between the Zulus and Boer settlers in the Transvaal. The Commission's findings largely favored Zulu claims, but Frere manipulated the situation to his advantage. On December 11, 1878, he delivered an impossible ultimatum to King Cetshwayo at the lower drift of the Tugela River. The demands were designed to be rejected. The Zulu army must be disbanded within 30 days, the military system abolished, and missionaries granted unrestricted access. Additionally, Cetshwayo must pay an enormous fine of cattle and accept a British resident. These terms would effectively end Zulu independence and reduce the proud kingdom to a British protectorate. Frere knew these conditions were unacceptable to any sovereign ruler, particularly one whose power rested upon military tradition. The ultimatum represented classic imperial manipulation, creating a casus belli while appearing to offer diplomatic resolution. Cetshwayo's inevitable rejection would justify the invasion Frere had planned from the beginning. King Cetshwayo received Frere's ultimatum with a mixture of anger and resignation, understanding its true purpose. The Zulu king had consistently sought peaceful relations with the British, even restraining his warriors from retaliating against border provocations. However, the ultimatum's terms struck at the very heart of Zulu identity and independence. The military system wasn't merely organizational, it was fundamental to Zulu society, politics, and culture. Young men earned their status through military service, and the age-grade regiments formed the backbone of social structure. Disbanding the army would destroy Zulu civilization as thoroughly as military conquest. Cetshwayo consulted with his indunas, counselors, and attempted diplomatic responses, suggesting modifications and seeking compromise. He sent envoys to British authorities, hoping to find middle ground that would preserve Zulu autonomy while addressing British concerns. These efforts proved futile, as Frere had already rejected any negotiation. The 30-day deadline approached relentlessly, while Cetshwayo prepared his people for the inevitable war, knowing that resistance meant facing the world's most powerful military machine with traditional weapons and ancient tactics. As the ultimatum deadline expired on January 11, 1879, British forces prepared for invasion along multiple fronts. General Lord Chelmsford commanded approximately 18,000 troops divided into 3 columns designed to converge on Ulundi, the Zulu capital. The strategy seemed sound on paper. Overwhelming force applied simultaneously would prevent Zulu concentration and ensure swift victory. The central column, strongest of the 3, included regular British infantry regiments, colonial volunteers, and native auxiliaries. Advanced weaponry gave the British tremendous advantages: Martini Henry rifles, artillery pieces, and Gatling guns against Zulu assegais and cowhide shields. However, Chelmsford underestimated both Zulu military intelligence and tactical sophistication. The British advance into Zululand began with confidence bordering on arrogance, as officers expected easy victory against primitive African warriors. Colonial newspapers already celebrated anticipated triumph, while London planned victory parades. This hubris would prove catastrophic as Zulu commanders demonstrated strategic brilliance that European military academies hadn't anticipated. The invasion commenced with British forces crossing the Buffalo River at multiple points, beginning 6 months of brutal warfare. On January 22, 1879, British forces established camp at Isandlwana beneath the distinctive Sphinx-shaped mountain. Lord Chelmsford split his forces, taking half to investigate reported Zulu movements while leaving approximately 17 men to guard the camp. This decision violated basic military principles by dividing forces in enemy territory without proper reconnaissance or defensive preparations. The camp remained unfenced and poorly positioned, despite warnings from experienced colonial officers who understood Zulu tactical capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pulleen commanded the mixed force of regular infantry, colonial volunteers, and native auxiliaries. Meanwhile, a massive Zulu impi of over 20,000 warriors had been shadowing British movements, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The Zulu commanders demonstrated remarkable patience and tactical acumen, avoiding premature engagement while maneuvering their forces into attack positions. As dawn broke over Isandlwana, neither side fully understood what the day would bring, but Zulu scouts reported the divided British force to their commanders. The stage was set for one of the most shocking military defeats in British colonial history, as overconfidence met tactical brilliance in the shadow of the Sphinx Mountain. The Battle of Isandlwana erupted with devastating swiftness as 20,000 Zulu warriors emerged from concealment in the Engwebeni Valley. The Zulu army advanced in their traditional Horns of the Beast formation, a tactical masterpiece that would envelop and destroy the British force. The central chest, comprising veteran regiments, advanced directly toward the camp, while the Horns swept wide to encircle their enemies. British firepower initially seemed effective as Martini Henry rifles cut down charging warriors, but ammunition supplies quickly became critical. The thin red line of British infantry found themselves facing overwhelming numbers as Zulu regiments absorbed terrible casualties while maintaining their advance. Colonial volunteers and native auxiliaries began retreating as the Zulu encirclement tightened, leaving regular troops isolated and outnumbered. Lieutenant Colonel Pulleen desperately tried to coordinate defense, while ammunition runners struggled to supply the firing line. The Zulu advance was relentless and disciplined, with warriors using terrain and numerical superiority to negate British technological advantages. Within hours, the most powerful empire on Earth suffered its greatest defeat at the hands of African warriors armed with traditional weapons, courage, and superior tactics. The annihilation at Isandlwana was total and shocking. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops perished, including 52 officers, while Zulu casualties numbered approximately 1,000 warriors. The defeat represented more than military failure. It shattered Victorian assumptions about European superiority and colonial invincibility. Young officers who had expected easy glory found themselves overwhelmed by disciplined African warriors fighting for their homeland. The Zulu victory demonstrated sophisticated military planning and execution that confounded European observers. Regimental colors were captured, artillery pieces overrun, and the camp thoroughly sacked. News of the disaster reached London weeks later, causing political uproar and public consternation. Queen Victoria herself demanded explanations for the catastrophe that had befallen her army in distant Zululand. The battle's aftermath saw Zulu warriors taking weapons, ammunition, and supplies while honoring fallen enemies according to their customs. However, this stunning victory came at enormous cost, as King Cetshwayo understood that defeating the British Empire would only bring greater retaliation. The dead at Isandlwana included some of Britain's finest soldiers, their sacrifice ultimately serving imperial ambitions they had never questioned. While disaster unfolded at Isandlwana, a portion of the Zulu army advanced toward Rorke's Drift, a small mission station serving as a British supply depot and hospital. Approximately 4,000 Zulu warriors, many from the Undai regiment, approached the station where 150 British and colonial troops had taken defensive positions. Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers assumed command, working alongside Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot to organize the defense. The station's buildings were quickly converted into a fortress using mealie bags, biscuit boxes, and anything available for barricades. This hastily improvised defense would become legendary in British military history. The defenders included regular infantry, hospital patients, and colonial volunteers, men who understood their desperate situation but refused to retreat. As afternoon turned to evening on January 22, 1879, the first Zulu attacks began against the perimeter. The battle that followed would last through the night, testing British resolve against overwhelming odds. Unlike Isandlwana, Rorke's drift would demonstrate how disciplined firepower and defensive positions could offset numerical disadvantage, though at terrible cost for both sides. The Battle of Rorke's Drift commenced at approximately 4:30 p.m. on January 22, 1879, as Zulu warriors launched their first assault against the mission station's perimeter. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, testing every section of the hastily constructed defenses. British rifles cracked incessantly as defenders poured devastating fire into attacking formations, but the Zulus pressed forward with remarkable courage and determination. The hospital building became a particular focus of fighting as wounded soldiers defended room by room, while Zulu warriors broke through walls and windows. Private Henry Hook and others conducted a fighting withdrawal through the hospital, evacuating patients under fire while holding off attackers with bayonet and rifle. The defensive perimeter gradually contracted as pressure mounted from all sides, forcing British troops to abandon outer positions and concentrate their firepower. Throughout the night, waves of Zulu attacks crashed against British defenses like surf against rocks. The defenders' ammunition supply became critical as the battle raged for 12 continuous hours. Officers and enlisted men fought side by side, their survival depending on disciplined volleys and desperate courage in the face of overwhelming numbers determined to avenge Isandlwana. As dawn broke on January 23, 1879, the Zulu assault on Rorke's Drift finally ceased after 12 hours of continuous fighting. The small garrison had achieved the impossible, repelling over 4,000 warriors through disciplined firepower and incredible determination. British casualties numbered 15 dead and 12 wounded from the 150 defenders, while Zulu losses reached approximately 300 and 500 warriors. The mission station resembled a charnel house, surrounded by evidence of the night's ferocious battle. Spent cartridge cases covered the ground like brass confetti, while bloodstains marked every defensive position. The hospital building lay in ruins, its walls pierced by assegai thrusts and bullet holes. Exhausted defenders surveyed the carnage with mixture of relief and horror, scarcely believing their survival against such overwhelming odds. The defense of Rorke's Drift provided the British Empire with a desperately needed victory narrative after the Isandlwana disaster. 11 Victoria Crosses would be awarded for the action, the most ever given for a single engagement. However, the battle's heroic reputation couldn't mask the broader strategic situation. British forces remained vulnerable in hostile territory, while Zulu military capability had been dramatically demonstrated. News of Isandlwana reached London in February 1879, creating political crisis and public outrage throughout the British Empire. The disaster represented the worst defeat suffered by British arms since the Crimean War, shattering confidence in imperial military supremacy. Queen Victoria demanded immediate explanations, while Parliament debated the competence of colonial administrators and military commanders. Sir Bartle Frere faced severe criticism for precipitating the war without authorization from London, though government officials had tacitly supported his aggressive policies. The press struggled to explain how modern European troops could be overwhelmed by savage, African warriors armed with traditional weapons. Military reinforcements were immediately dispatched to Natal, including guards regiments and artillery batteries deemed necessary to restore British prestige. The defeat also had profound implications throughout the empire, encouraging resistance movements in India, Afghanistan, and other colonies where British rule faced challenges. Meanwhile, King Cetshwayo attempted diplomatic overtures, hoping to negotiate peace before facing inevitable British retaliation. The Zulu king understood that defeating the British Empire's forces would ultimately bring overwhelming retribution, but his offers of negotiation were rejected by authorities determined to restore imperial credibility through military victory rather than diplomatic compromise. General Sir Garnet Wolseley arrived in South Africa during May 1879 with extensive reinforcements and clear instructions to complete the conquest of Zululand. The British Army had learned painful lessons from Isandlwana, implementing new tactics, improved logistics, and defensive procedures designed to prevent another disaster. Column advances now included proper reconnaissance, fortified camps, and concentrated firepower that wouldn't repeat Chelmsford's mistakes. However, the war's character had fundamentally changed as Zulu forces adopted guerrilla tactics, avoiding major engagements while harassing British communications and supply lines. King Cetshwayo faced internal pressures as the conflict's costs mounted, with cattle herds depleted, crops unharvested, and warrior casualties undermining military strength. The king continued seeking diplomatic solutions, understanding that prolonged warfare would destroy his kingdom regardless of tactical victories. British forces systematically devastated Zulu territory, burning kraals, capturing cattle, and destroying food supplies in campaigns designed to break popular resistance. This total war approach reflected imperial determination to crush Zulu independence completely, making negotiated settlement impossible. The conflict had evolved beyond territorial disputes into existential struggle between incompatible visions of Southern African political organization. The Battle of Ulundi on July 4, 1879, represented the climactic engagement of the Anglo-Zulu War as British forces finally advanced on the Zulu capital. General Lord Chelmsford, seeking to redeem his reputation after Isandlwana, commanded approximately 42,000 troops supported by artillery and Gatling guns. The British formed a large square formation that provided concentrated firepower from all sides, learning from previous disasters to maintain defensive integrity while advancing. King Cetshwayo assembled his remaining forces for this final confrontation, mustering approximately 15,000 warriors despite heavy casualties from months of warfare. The Zulu army attacked with traditional courage and discipline, but faced devastating firepower that previous generations had never encountered. Artillery shells tore gaps in attacking formations, while rifles maintained continuous volleys from the square's faces. The battle lasted only 30 minutes, but its outcome was decisive. Zulu military power was finally broken after months of resistance. British casualties were minimal compared to Zulu losses, which numbered over 1,500 warriors. The defeat ended organized Zulu resistance and opened the way for the kingdom's complete conquest, though sporadic fighting continued for several weeks as remaining impi dissolved into scattered bands of desperate men. Following their victory at Ulundi, British forces systematically occupied Zululand and began the final destruction of the kingdom's political structure. King Cetshwayo fled his burning capital as troops looted and destroyed the royal kraal, including the symbolic heart of Zulu power. The king sought refuge in remote areas of his former kingdom, hoping to continue resistance or negotiate honorable surrender terms. However, British authorities were determined to capture him and complete the conquest through his personal submission. On August 28, 1879, British forces finally located and captured King Cetshwayo in the Ngome forest, ending the last hope of continued Zulu independence. The capture was accomplished without violence, as the king's remaining supporters lacked strength to resist the overwhelming British presence throughout Zululand. Cetshwayo's dignity in defeat impressed even his captors, who recognized his intelligence and leadership qualities despite their imperial prejudices. The king's capture marked the effective end of the Anglo-Zulu War, though formal peace negotiations and territorial arrangements would take additional months to complete. The proud monarch who had ruled over one of Africa's most powerful kingdoms now faced exile and the complete destruction of his people's traditional way of life. The Anglo-Zulu War officially ended in September 1879 with the complete conquest of Zululand and the destruction of the Zulu Kingdom's political independence. British casualties for the entire campaign totaled approximately 1,300 dead, including the disaster at Isandlwana and various smaller engagements throughout the territory. Zulu losses were significantly higher, with estimates ranging from 8,000 to 10,000 warriors killed and countless civilians affected by the destruction of their traditional society. The war's conclusion saw Zululand divided into 13 separate territories under appointed chiefs, deliberately fragmenting Zulu unity to prevent future resistance. King Cetshwayo was transporting to Cape Town as a prisoner, though he would later be taken to London, where he became a celebrity figure who challenged Victorian assumptions about African rulers. The British Empire had restored its military prestige at enormous cost, but the victory's brutality raised questions about imperial methods and moral justification. Colonial administrators now faced the complex task of governing a conquered population whose traditional structures had been systematically destroyed. The war's aftermath would influence British colonial policy throughout Africa, demonstrating both the costs of resistance to imperial expansion and the devastating effectiveness of modern military technology against traditional societies. King Cetshwayo's exile to Cape Town in September 1879 began a remarkable chapter in the war's aftermath that would challenge British imperial assumptions about African leadership. The captive king impressed his captors with intelligence, dignity, and political sophistication that contradicted racist stereotypes prevalent in Victorian society. British officials found themselves dealing with a ruler whose understanding of international politics and diplomatic protocols exceeded many colonial administrators' expectations. Cetshwayo's presence in Cape Town attracted considerable attention from both critics and supporters of British imperial policy, with many observers noting the contrast between his noble bearing and the brutality of his conquest. The king used his captivity to challenge British justifications for the war, arguing persuasively that he had sought peaceful relations while defending his people's sovereignty against unprovoked aggression. His articulate defense of Zulu rights embarrassed officials who had portrayed the conflict as civilizing mission against savage barbarism. Meanwhile, in Zululand itself, the imposed territorial divisions created ongoing instability as traditional authority structures collapsed and competing chiefs struggled for power. The fragmentation of the kingdom produced exactly the chaos that Cetshwayo had warned would result from destroying established political institutions. In 1882, King Cetshwayo was taken to London, where he met Queen Victoria and became an unexpected celebrity in British society. His visit created sensation throughout the empire as the African king who had defeated British forces at Isandlwana now moved through London's highest social circles with remarkable aplomb. The meeting with Queen Victoria was particularly significant, as two monarchs discussed the destruction of one kingdom by another with surprising courtesy and mutual respect. Cetshwayo's London sojourn challenged prevalent racial assumptions as he demonstrated intellectual capabilities and cultural sophistication that confounded Victorian expectations about African rulers. His articulate criticism of British colonial policy embarrassed government officials, while his dignified bearing impressed society figures who had expected to meet a savage African chief. The king's presence in London also provided focus for growing criticism of imperial methods, as humanitarian groups used his case to highlight the brutality and injustice of colonial conquest. However, his temporary celebrity status couldn't restore his kingdom's independence, as British authorities remained determined to maintain political fragmentation in Zululand. The irony of his situation, celebrated in London while his people suffered under colonial rule, epitomized the contradictions of Victorian imperial ideology that claimed to bring civilization while destroying established African societies. King Cetshwayo returned to Zululand in 1883 to find his former kingdom devastated by civil war and political fragmentation. The British partition had created territorial rivalries between appointed chiefs, leading to conflicts that produced more casualties than the original Anglo-Zulu War. Traditional Zulu society had collapsed under the strain of imposed political divisions, economic disruption, and the loss of central authority that had maintained order for decades. The king's restoration to a portion of his former territory came too late to prevent the social disintegration that British policy had intentionally created. Competing chiefs had developed their own power bases during Cetshwayo's exile, making reunification impossible without renewed warfare that the king lacked resources to conduct. The British had achieved their objective of permanently fragmenting Zulu political unity, ensuring that no future leader could challenge colonial authority as effectively as Cetshwayo had done. The king's final months were marked by frustration and sadness as he witnessed his people's continued suffering under a system designed to prevent African political independence. His death in February 1884 ended the last direct link to the great Zulu Kingdom that had once dominated southeastern Africa, leaving only memories and legends of a proud people's resistance to imperial conquest. The Anglo-Zulu War's long-term consequences extended far beyond the battlefield casualties and territorial changes imposed by British conquest. The conflict demonstrated that even sophisticated African military systems could not ultimately resist European industrial warfare, encouraging further imperial expansion throughout the continent. The war's methods, systematic destruction of political structures, economic foundations, and social institutions, became standard practice for European colonization efforts across Africa during the following decades. For the Zulu people, the war's aftermath brought cultural devastation as traditional authority structures, military organizations, and political institutions were systematically dismantled to prevent future resistance. The kingdom's fragmentation created lasting divisions within Zulu society, while economic disruption forced many warriors into migrant labor that further undermined traditional social patterns. The conflict also influenced British military doctrine, as lessons learned from Isandlwana and subsequent engagements shaped colonial warfare tactics throughout the empire. The war's legacy included both heroic narratives of imperial courage at Rorke's Drift and troubling questions about the morality of conquest that continued to challenge British colonial policy. Most significantly, the destruction of Zulu independence marked a crucial step in the European partition of Africa that would dominate the continent for the next century. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 stands as one of history's most dramatic examples of the collision between traditional African societies and European imperial expansion. The conflict revealed both the courage of Zulu warriors defending their homeland and the tragic inevitability of their defeat against industrial military technology. King Cetshwayo's dignity in defeat and his people's resistance to conquest challenged Victorian assumptions about African capabilities while demonstrating the human cost of imperial ambition. The war's battles, from the shocking British defeat at Isandlwana to the heroic defense of Rorke's Drift and the final destruction at Ulundi, became legends that continue to fascinate military historians and the general public. However, beyond the dramatic battles and individual heroism, the war represents the systematic destruction of an indigenous African kingdom that had successfully resisted European encroachment for decades. The Zulu Kingdom's fate foreshadowed the experience of countless African societies during the European partition of the continent, as traditional political structures, economic systems, and cultural institutions were swept away by colonial conquest. The war's legacy reminds us that imperial expansion However heroic its individual episodes might appear, ultimately destroyed civilizations and peoples whose contributions to human history deserve recognition and remembrance. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.